It started with a voice almost no one knew. Not a palace source, not a court document, not a verified investigation. Just a man, a bar, a story, and somehow that was enough to set the internet on fire. What happens when a single claim, spoken thousands of miles away from Buckingham Palace, suddenly detonates across social media timelines, YouTube thumbnails, and tabloid headlines? What happens when the name Meghan Markle is attached to it? And more importantly, why did this story resurface now? Because here's the uncomfortable truth we need to confront right from the beginning. This wasn't just about what was said. It was about when it was said, how it was said, and who benefited from the chaos that followed. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. In the span of a few days, an obscure figure from Argentina became the center of a global backlash. Clips were shared without context. Headlines grew sharper by the hour. Speculation outran verification. And suddenly, millions of people were arguing about something most of them had never heard of a week earlier. Pause for a second and ask yourself honestly, how many times have you seen this pattern before? A rumor emerges. Outrage follows. Silence is interpreted as guilt, and the story grows legs of its own. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This time, the target was Meghan. Supporters immediately called it character assassination. Critics framed it as long-buried truth finally surfacing. And the palace? Silent. That silence became its own headline. But before we even touch the claims themselves, we need to understand the environment that allowed them to explode. Because stories like this don't survive on facts alone. They survive on emotion, on timing, on algorithmic oxygen. And the timing could not have been more volatile. Public sentiment around the Sussexes was already divided. Every appearance, every interview, every absence was being dissected. Trust was fragile. Patience was thin. And then, into that pressure cooker, came a voice from Argentina claiming to know a version of Meghan's past that contradicted everything the public thought they understood. Was it truth? Was it bitterness? Was it opportunism? Or was it something even simpler? A man realizing that controversy is currency? That's the part most people miss. Because this story didn't grow because it was proven. It grew because it was shareable. Think about it. A bar owner, an exotic setting, a suggestion of secrets, and a royal name. That combination is irresistible to the modern attention economy. You don't need evidence when outrage fills the gaps. You don't need verification when emotion does the work for you. And once the machine starts moving, stopping it becomes nearly impossible. But here's where things get even more complicated. Every denial fed the fire. Every defense was reframed as deflection. Every moment of silence was treated as confirmation. Meghan didn't respond. Harry didn't issue a statement. The palace didn't intervene. And into that vacuum, speculation rushed in. Was this a calculated move to avoid amplifying the rumor? Or was it paralysis? Or something else entirely? Ask yourself this. If you were innocent, would you speak immediately? Or would you trust that truth eventually outlives noise? History shows us that truth doesn't always win. It just survives longer than some lies. But survival comes at a cost. Because once a rumor attaches itself to a public figure, it never fully disappears. It becomes a footnote, a whisper, a suggestion that resurfaces whenever the narrative needs fuel. That's why this story matters now. Not because of what one man claimed, but because of how easily the world was willing to believe him. And that should unsettle everyone. Because if a story with this many unanswered questions can spread this fast, what does that say about the next one? Before we examine the claims, we have to examine the claimant. Before we judge the silence, we have to understand the strategy. Before we pick sides, we have to confront how manipulation actually works. And it all starts with one question most people skipped entirely. Who is the man from Argentina? And why did he decide to speak now? Because when you peel back the outrage, the timelines, and the headlines, what emerges isn't clarity. It's something far more revealing. And what comes next would turn this story in a direction almost no one expected. Who was this man? That question should have been asked immediately. But it wasn't. Because outrage moves faster than curiosity. By the time most people even thought to ask who he was, the clips were already everywhere. Cropped, captioned, stripped of context. His words traveling farther than his identity ever did. So let's rewind. slowly, carefully, because stories like this don't begin with scandal. They begin with obscurity. Long before his name started appearing in comment sections and reaction videos, he was just another business owner in Argentina. A bar, a nightlife scene, a city that has seen thousands of people pass through its doors over decades. Tourists, locals, expats, people chasing something, people hiding from something. That detail matters more than it seems. Bars are confessional spaces. They are where stories are exaggerated, where memories blur, where truth and performance mingle freely. And for years, this man lived entirely outside global relevance. No interviews, no headlines, no international scrutiny, which raises the first uncomfortable question. Why now? Because people don't suddenly remember explosive secrets after decades of silence without a reason. Silence itself is a choice, and breaking it is never accidental. According to his own telling, he had watched Meghan's rise from afar, watched her transform from a little-known actress into a global figure, then into royalty, then into a lightning rod of controversy. And somehow, all that time, he said nothing. Not when she married Prince Harry. Not during the early years of global fascination. Not during the height of royal goodwill. He waited. And that delay is the first crack in the story. Ask yourself honestly. If someone knew something truly damning, something that contradicted a carefully curated public image, why stay quiet through the most profitable years of that image? Why speak only when sentiment is already fractured? Timing reveals intent more often than words do. When he finally emerged, it wasn't through an investigative journalist. It wasn't through legal filings. It wasn't through sworn testimony. It was through casual conversation. An interview that felt informal, almost offhand, as if he were reminiscing rather than accusing. And that tone was crucial, because people trust casualness. A man leaning back, speaking as if he has nothing to gain, feels authentic. He doesn't sound rehearsed. He doesn't sound strategic. And that illusion of spontaneity is incredibly powerful. But listen closely, and patterns begin to appear. He positioned himself as an observer, not a participant. Someone who had seen things, heard things, absorbed atmosphere. He didn't claim direct involvement. He claimed proximity. That's a clever distinction. Proximity gives plausible deniability. It allows suggestion without responsibility. It invites audiences to connect dots for him. And once audiences start doing that work, the story no longer belongs to the speaker. It belongs to the crowd. That's when it becomes dangerous. But before his words ever went viral, his background went almost entirely unchecked. What kind of bar was this? What years was he referring to? Who else worked there? Who else remembers this era? These are the questions journalists usually start with. Instead, social media started with outrage. Within hours, narratives hardened. Supporters dismissed him as a liar chasing attention. Critics framed him as a truth-teller silenced for too long. And somewhere in between, nuance was crushed. Yet when independent voices began looking into his past statements, inconsistencies quietly surfaced. Dates that shifted, descriptions that changed slightly depending on the audience, details that became sharper with each retelling. That doesn't automatically mean falsehood. Memory is imperfect, especially when mixed with storytelling instincts honed behind a bar counter. But inconsistency erodes credibility. And credibility is everything in stories like this. Another overlooked detail. This man had never previously positioned himself as a whistleblower. There was no pattern of exposing wrongdoing. No history of challenging powerful figures. No trail of risk-taking that suggested moral urgency. This was not someone known for speaking truth to power. This was someone suddenly discovering power in speaking. That distinction matters. Because there's a difference between risking something to tell a story and gaining something from it. As attention grew, so did the amplification. Interviews followed. Reaction videos multiplied. Each retelling sharpened the edges. What began as suggestion hardened into assertion in the mouths of others. And notice this carefully. The most extreme claims were rarely spoken by him directly. They were inferred, extrapolated, repeated by people who had never set foot in Argentina, never visited the bar, never met the man. The story mutated as it spread. That's how rumor ecosystems work. One source, hundreds of interpretations, thousands of conclusions. And suddenly, the original speaker becomes almost irrelevant. The narrative takes on a life of its own. But still, one question lingered. Why him? Why was this particular voice elevated above all others who might have known Meghan during her earlier years? The answer lies in simplicity. His story was cinematic, an exotic location, a shadowy setting, a suggestion of hidden worlds. It fit neatly into pre-existing biases. For those inclined to distrust Meghan, it confirmed suspicions. For those inclined to defend her, it became proof of character assassination. Either way, it generated engagement. And engagement is the currency that keeps stories alive. What almost no one paused to consider was the possibility that the man himself was being swept along by forces larger than him. That once the machine started, he no longer controlled where it went. Because attention is intoxicating. The moment your words travel farther than you ever have, the temptation to lean into them is strong. To clarify, to add color, to respond to critics. And with each response, the narrative evolves. This is where credibility is either reinforced or destroyed. As scrutiny increased, journalists began asking questions he hadn't anticipated. Requests for corroboration, for names, for dates, for records. And that's when the story started to wobble. Answers became vague. References became general. Specifics dissolved into atmosphere. Again, this doesn't automatically prove deceit, but it exposes fragility. A strong truth withstands pressure. A weak one reshapes itself to survive. And as pressure mounted, something else happened. The man's tone shifted. He no longer sounded casual. He sounded defensive. Criticism annoyed him. Skepticism angered him. And that emotional response mattered, because it reframed his motivation. Was this about truth or about being believed? Those two things are not the same. Truth doesn't need validation, but ego does. And when ego enters the equation, objectivity exits. Meanwhile, the internet did what it always does. It simplified. Complex timelines were reduced to headlines. Nuanced uncertainty was flattened into certainty. And the more outrageous the interpretation, the farther it traveled. At this point, the story was no longer about what happened in Argentina. It was about power. Who controls the narrative? Who gets believed? Who gets erased? Meghan became the symbol. The bar owner became the catalyst. But the real driver was something else entirely. Audience hunger. Because scandal feels participatory. It invites judgment. It allows people to feel informed, righteous, involved. And the platforms reward that feeling relentlessly. But then, something unexpected happened. As deeper digging continued, someone noticed a detail that didn't fit. A timeline discrepancy that couldn't be smoothed over. A claim that clashed with publicly verifiable records. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't flashy. But it was undeniable. And once that detail surfaced, the story stopped being about allegations and started becoming about credibility itself. Because if that one detail was wrong, what else was? And that's when the narrative began to fracture. But what that discrepancy revealed, and who uncovered it, would push this story into an entirely different phase. One that neither supporters nor critics were prepared for. And the interview that followed would change everything. It only took one clip. Not the full interview. Not the context. Not the pauses, the hesitations, or the moments where the speaker seemed unsure. Just one clip. Less than a minute long. That's all it took to ignite the fire. Ask yourself something before we go any further. How often do you watch the full source anymore? How often do you trust the caption more than the content? Because that's exactly where this story tipped from obscurity into chaos. The interview itself was unremarkable at first glance. No dramatic lighting. No investigative framing. Just a conversation. A man speaking casually about his past, his bar, his memories. The kind of interview that usually disappears into the digital void. Until someone clipped it. They cut out the qualifiers. They removed the uncertainty. They isolated the most provocative phrasing. And suddenly, suggestion looked like certainty. That clip didn't spread because it was proven. It spread because it was efficient. Efficient outrage. Efficient suspicion. Efficient storytelling. A short video that required no background knowledge and offered instant emotional payoff. You didn't need to know who the man was. You didn't need to know the timeline. You just needed to feel something. And people did. Within hours, reaction channels jumped in. Some skeptical, some supportive. Most sensational. Each adding a layer of interpretation that pushed the narrative further from its origin. Here's the irony no one wants to admit. The more people reacted, the less the original words mattered. Because reaction content doesn't amplify truth. It amplifies engagement. And engagement thrives on escalation. A measured response doesn't go viral. A cautious take doesn't trend. But certainty does, especially when it's wrapped in shock. This is where the story crossed a critical threshold. Once multiple creators repeated the claim as a claim, audiences began hearing it as fact. Not because anyone proved it, but because repetition creates familiarity. And familiarity feels like truth. Psychologists call this the illusory truth effect. Say something often enough, and the brain stops questioning it. That effect was working over time. What's even more telling is who the clip appealed to most strongly. People who already distrusted Meghan felt validated. People who already defended her felt attacked. And people in the middle were pulled into the spectacle simply because it was everywhere. The algorithm didn't care which side you were on. It cared that you stayed. And you did. Comments filled with certainty appeared almost immediately. He wouldn't lie. Why would he make this up? They're hiding something. The palace always covers things up. Notice how quickly I think becomes I know. But here's the part that rarely gets discussed. The clip wasn't shared by journalists first. It wasn't picked up by major outlets immediately. It spread horizontally, not vertically. Peer-to-peer. Creator to viewer. Viewer to viewer. That kind of spread feels organic. It feels authentic. And because it doesn't come from an institution, it feels less manipulative. But that's an illusion. Decentralized spread doesn't mean neutral spread. It just means no one is accountable. And accountability is the first casualty in viral scandals. As the clips circulated, the man himself began responding, not with clarifications, but with additional interviews. Each one longer, each one more detailed, each one slightly more confident. That progression should make you pause. Memory doesn't usually sharpen under pressure. It blurs. But storytelling sharpens, especially when rewarded. Every new interview added color, added context, added narrative coherence. The story became smoother, more complete, less tentative. That's when critics started asking hard questions. Why didn't these details appear earlier? Why now? Why this sequence? And the answers weren't satisfying. The man said he hadn't been asked, that he was misunderstood, that his words were twisted, which might be true. But here's the problem. When a story can only survive by constant clarification, it's not stable. It's reactive. And reactive narratives rarely hold up over time. Meanwhile, the media ecosystem did what it always does during controversy. It polarized. Outlets sympathetic to Meghan framed the claims as baseless rumor. Outlets hostile to her framed them as explosive revelations. Neutral reporting struggled to exist in the middle because neutrality doesn't attract clicks in a firestorm. So what happened? People stopped asking whether the claims were true and started arguing about whether they should be believed. That shift is subtle, but critical. Because belief is subjective. Truth is not. And once belief becomes the battleground, facts lose their power. You could see it in comment sections. People weren't debating evidence. They were debating character. She's always been fake. She's always been targeted. This fits her pattern. This is another smear. None of those statements require proof. They require alignment. And alignment is what the internet rewards. But here's where the story took another turn. Someone decided to go back to the source. Not the clip. Not the reaction videos. The full interview. They listened carefully. Frame by frame. Tone by tone. And what they noticed was unsettling. The certainty people heard in the clip wasn't actually there. It had been created by omission. Hesitations removed. Qualifiers cut. Context erased. What remained sounded definitive, but only because everything that softened it was gone. This revelation didn't go viral. Of course it didn't. Corrections rarely do. But among those who saw it, doubt crept in. If the clip was misleading, what else had been reshaped? If interpretation did the work, where did truth end and narrative begin? And then came the timeline problem. A viewer noticed a date mentioned casually in one interview that didn't align with publicly available records. Not sensational, just off by enough to matter. They posted about it quietly. No screaming headline. No dramatic thumbnail. Just a question. How could he have been there at that time if this record says otherwise? That question should have stopped the story cold. Instead, it was ignored. Because by then, the narrative had momentum. And momentum doesn't pause for inconvenient details. But the question didn't disappear. It lingered. Shared among skeptics. The man's earlier interviews were revisited line by line. Not by angry viewers, but by people trained to notice patterns, shifts in language, evolving claims, emotional spikes where facts should be. And one thing became clear. The story had grown more detailed over time, not less. That's not how memory usually works. Memory decays. Stories expand. This expansion wasn't necessarily malicious. It could have been unconscious. Storytelling instincts filling gaps. Responding to criticism by reinforcing narrative coherence. But coherence is not corroboration. And journalists don't confuse the two. At the same time, another contradiction surfaced. In one interview, he claimed limited interaction. In another, he implied deeper familiarity. When challenged, he framed the difference as misinterpretation. But the words were there, recorded, unambiguous. This wasn't twisting. This was inconsistency. That's when the narrative began shifting again. Not publicly, not dramatically, but internally. Editors asked whether this story was strong enough to publish responsibly. Legal teams weighed in. Questions of defamation, verification, and public interest became central. Because here's the truth most viewers never see. Media outlets don't ask whether something is interesting. They ask whether it's defensible. And this story was becoming harder to defend. Meanwhile, online spaces doubled down. When evidence weakens, belief strengthens. That's how polarization works. Supporters of the claims dismissed discrepancies as technicalities. Defenders of Meghan highlighted them as proof of fabrication. The middle ground collapsed. And once the middle collapses, truth becomes collateral damage. But then, a small but crucial development occurred. Someone who had been present during the period in question spoke up. Not loudly, not publicly at first. They didn't confirm the claims. They didn't deny them outright. They simply said something that destabilized everything. That they remembered the environment differently. Different dynamics. Different people. Different timeline. This wasn't a counter-accusation. It was a contradiction of atmosphere. And atmosphere matters because it shapes plausibility. If the setting isn't what's described, the story loses oxygen. Journalists took notice. Requests for on-the-record statements were made. Some declined. Some asked for time. Some stopped responding altogether. Silence spread, but it wasn't uniform. It clustered. Certain questions went unanswered consistently. Certain details were avoided repeatedly. That pattern speaks louder than denial. Because if a story is solid, there's no reason to avoid specific questions. The public didn't see this happening in real time. They saw the loudest voices, not the quiet scrutiny. They saw creators arguing, not editors hesitating. But behind the scenes, the story was being weighed, and it was getting heavier. This is the phase where many viral scandals die quietly. They don't collapse. They simply fade as attention moves on and verification fails to catch up. But this one didn't fade, because something else entered the picture. Motivation. As journalists examined the man's recent activity, they noticed a shift coinciding with the controversy. Increased visibility. New opportunities. Invitations. Attention he'd never had before. Again, this doesn't prove deception, but it introduces incentive. An incentive changes how stories are told. Once a narrative becomes rewarding, consciously or not, it adapts to sustain that reward. This is where the line between memory and performance blurs. And that blur is fatal to credibility. Because credibility depends on restraint. And restraint was disappearing. The story was no longer just about what was claimed. It was about how those claims behaved under pressure. And under pressure, cracks were spreading. But the most damaging crack hadn't surfaced yet. Because buried beneath interviews and reactions was one detail that hadn't been examined closely enough. A detail so mundane that it escaped outrage. So boring that it didn't trend. Until someone connected it to something else. And when they did, the contradiction was no longer theoretical. It was factual. And once that connection became public, the story would enter its most volatile stage yet. The stage where narratives don't just wobble. They break. Silence is never empty. It's interpreted, projected onto, filled with whatever the audience already believes. And in scandals like this, silence becomes the loudest sound in the room. As the story fractured and credibility questions surfaced, one thing remained unchanged. Meghan said nothing. No statement. No clarification. No carefully worded denial released through intermediaries. Nothing. For critics, this was confirmation. For supporters, it was restraint. For the media, it was a puzzle. Because silence can mean many things, but it's rarely accidental at this level. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to understand modern scandal culture. We live in an era where response time is everything. Brands, politicians, celebrities are expected to react immediately. Delay is framed as evasion. Hesitation becomes suspicion. But the royal ecosystem operates differently. Historically, silence was power. The crown didn't chase rumors. It waited them out. The idea was simple: attention starves without oxygen. But that strategy was developed in a world without social media. In today's environment, silence doesn't starve stories. It feeds speculation. Every hour without a response invites new narratives. Every day without a denial hardens assumptions. And yet, Meghan remained quiet. That decision, whether personal or strategic, created a vacuum. And vacuums don't stay empty for long. Into that space rushed commentary. She's hiding something. They're waiting for it to blow over. The palace is panicking. They're lawyering up. None of these claims required evidence. They only required imagination. And imagination thrives when information is scarce. What made this silence even more combustible was Meghan's history. She is not known for silence. In past controversies, she has spoken, sometimes directly, sometimes through interviews, sometimes through proxies. So when she didn't speak now, people noticed. Why this time? Why this story? Those questions dominated discourse. But behind the scenes, silence isn't passive. It's deliberate. Crisis management experts will tell you this. Responding too early can legitimize a false claim. Addressing an unverified allegation can elevate it from rumor to recognized issue. So sometimes, the smartest move is to wait. The problem is, waiting looks like weakness to an audience trained to expect immediacy. And that tension defined this moment. As days passed, the story continued mutating. New angles emerged. Old clips resurfaced. People connected unrelated dots. The original claim was barely referenced anymore. It had become a symbol, a placeholder for broader grievances. That's when something subtle happened. The conversation stopped being about Argentina. It became about Meghan herself. Her character, her past, her perceived authenticity. The rumor became a lens through which everything else was reinterpreted. Past interviews were reanalyzed. Old photos were recirculated. Moments once seen as harmless were reframed as suspicious. This is how narrative contagion works. Once a rumor sticks, it retroactively colors everything. And silence allows that process to accelerate unchecked. But inside the palace ecosystem, silence is not absence. It's calculation. Advisors weigh risk. Lawyers assess exposure. PR teams model scenarios. They ask questions the public never hears. Will responding amplify the claim? Will denial invite further scrutiny? Will engagement validate the source? And perhaps the most dangerous question of all, what if responding creates more headlines than staying silent? Because in modern media, rebuttals are often framed as admissions of relevance. And relevance is exactly what fragile stories need to survive. This calculus becomes even more complex when legal boundaries are involved. Allegations framed as rumor can still carry legal risk. Responding emotionally can expose new vulnerabilities. Saying too much can be worse than saying nothing. So silence persists. But silence has a cost. As the story dragged on, the absence of response began affecting allies. Supporters struggled to defend without official guidance. Neutral observers leaned toward suspicion simply because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. Humans don't like unresolved narratives. We crave closure. And when closure doesn't come, we invent it. That's why conspiracy theories thrive in silence. They fill gaps with certainty. At the same time, journalists noticed something else. The lack of response wasn't total. There were whispers, anonymous briefings, background conversations, carefully worded off-the-record remarks suggesting the claims were baseless. But none of it was public. None of it was quotable, which meant it couldn't counter the noise. It could only manage internal perception. This created a two-track reality. Privately, skepticism about the claims was growing. Publicly, outrage still dominated. And the gap between those realities widened. Then came the inevitable question. Why doesn't the palace step in? Historically, the palace has intervened when reputations are threatened. Statements are issued. Lines are drawn. But this time, nothing. That silence was interpreted in two opposite ways. Some believed it meant the palace didn't care. Others believed it meant the palace was scared. Both interpretations were wrong. The truth was more complicated. The palace doesn't defend individuals from every rumor. It defends the institution. And this story, while sensational, didn't directly threaten the crown. It threatened a person. And that distinction matters. Because institutional silence doesn't mean disbelief. It means prioritization. But public perception doesn't operate on institutional logic. It operates on emotion. So as days turned into weeks, pressure mounted. Creators demanded statements. Commentators speculated about legal action. Hashtags trended. Counter hashtags followed. The story refused to die. And then, something unexpected happened. A different narrative began gaining traction. Not about the claims themselves, but about the pattern. People started noticing that similar stories emerge repeatedly around the same figures. That they follow predictable arcs. That they peak quickly, then collapse under scrutiny. This meta-narrative didn't exonerate anyone, but it contextualized the chaos. It suggested that the story's persistence wasn't about truth, but about appetite. An appetite for scandal, for downfall, for moral theater. And that appetite doesn't require evidence. It requires a target. Silence, in that context, becomes a refusal to perform, a refusal to feed the machine. But refusal comes with risk. Because while silence may eventually starve a story, it doesn't stop the damage done along the way. Reputations aren't destroyed in one moment. They erode over time, through accumulation, through repetition, through association. Even debunked claims leave residue. And that's the tragedy of rumor culture. You don't need to prove anything to harm someone. You just need to raise the question. That realization began shifting some perspectives. People started asking not whether the claims were true, but whether the process was fair. Whether a single voice, amplified by algorithms, should be allowed to define someone's past without verification. Whether silence should be treated as guilt. Those questions didn't trend, but they lingered. And then came a turning point. A legal expert weighed in publicly, not about guilt or innocence, but about defamation thresholds. They explained how unverified claims, repeated widely, can cross legal lines even if framed as opinion. How platforms create distance between origin and amplification. How responsibility becomes diffuse. That commentary changed the tone. Suddenly, creators grew cautious. Language softened. Disclaimers appeared. Allegations were relabeled as claims. The story didn't vanish, but it slowed. And slowing is dangerous for viral narratives. Because once momentum breaks, scrutiny catches up. At the same time, Meghan's silence began to look less like avoidance and more like endurance. Endurance is not dramatic. It doesn't satisfy curiosity, but it outlasts outrage. Still, endurance doesn't equal vindication, because something else was happening beneath the surface. While public attention fixated on silence, behind the scenes, information was moving. Documents were being reviewed, timelines reconstructed, statements compared. And one of those internal reviews uncovered something that shifted everything. Not a denial, not a confession, a contradiction. One that didn't rely on memory or interpretation. One that existed on paper. And once that contradiction became visible, silence would no longer be the story. Evidence would be. And what that evidence revealed would force a reckoning no one expected. Everything changes the moment paper enters the room. Because stories can survive outrage. They can survive silence. They can even survive contradiction. But paper doesn't argue. It doesn't interpret. It just sits there. And once documents appear, narratives lose their flexibility. This is the phase no viral story wants to reach. Up until now, everything had been fluid. Claims, counterclaims, interpretations layered on top of interpretations. Memory versus memory, voice versus voice. But behind the scenes, while the internet argued and creators escalated, something far less dramatic was happening. People were checking records, not to defend, not to attack, but to understand. And understanding is dangerous when a story relies on ambiguity. The first review wasn't some explosive leak. It wasn't a dramatic reveal. It was procedural, a quiet reconstruction of timelines using publicly available information. Employment histories, travel windows, immigration records. Nothing sensational on its own. But when aligned side by side, something stood out. Not a smoking gun, a mismatch. A narrow window where the claims required two people to be in the same place at the same time, when at least one of them demonstrably wasn't. This didn't automatically disprove everything, but it created a structural problem. Because once a story depends on a specific overlap, and that overlap collapses, the narrative has to adjust. And adjusting is where credibility is tested. When this discrepancy was raised privately with people close to the story, reactions varied. Some dismissed it as irrelevant. Some questioned the accuracy of the records. Some asked for time, but none provided immediate reconciliation. And that pause mattered, because strong stories don't need time to reconcile basic facts. They already have them. As word of the discrepancy spread quietly among journalists and legal analysts, the tone shifted further. This was no longer about whether someone liked or disliked Meghan. It was about whether the claims could withstand minimal scrutiny. That's a much harder battle to win. Meanwhile, the man from Argentina found himself in a position he hadn't anticipated. He was no longer being asked to tell his story. He was being asked to prove it. Those are two very different experiences. Telling a story is empowering. Proving it is constraining. The interviews slowed. Responses became more guarded. Statements more carefully phrased. Where once there had been confidence, there was now defensiveness. That defensiveness showed up in subtle ways. Questions were reframed. Critics were accused of bad faith. Attention was shifted back to Meghan rather than the claims themselves. This is a classic move. When facts become uncomfortable, redirect the spotlight. But redirection only works when the audience is still emotionally invested. And by this point, emotional certainty was eroding. Not collapsing, eroding. Creators who had initially leaned heavily into outrage began hedging. They added qualifiers. Allegedly. According to. Claims suggest. Language softened. Not because opinions changed overnight, but because risk awareness increased. Once documentation enters the conversation, liability follows. And liability makes people careful. This is where the palace's earlier silence began to look prescient. By not responding early, they hadn't committed to any version of events. They hadn't locked themselves into a rebuttal that could later be undermined. They hadn't amplified the claim into legitimacy. They waited. And waiting allowed something important to happen. The burden shifted. Instead of Meghan needing to disprove a rumor, the source now needed to substantiate it. That's a subtle but crucial reversal. Because disproving a negative is almost impossible. But substantiating a positive claim requires evidence. Evidence that, so far, wasn't appearing. At the same time, legal analysts began speaking more openly. Not about guilt or innocence, but about exposure. They explained how repeated unverified allegations can create cascading liability, how platforms rely on distance from original claims, how creators assume disclaimers protect them when they often don't. That analysis chilled the atmosphere. Videos were quietly taken down. Titles were edited. Comments were moderated. None of this made headlines. But it changed behavior. And behavior tells you more than statements ever will. The story didn't stop, but it lost its teeth. Then came the question no one wanted to ask out loud. What if the story was never about truth at all? What if it was about relevance? Because for the first time, attention was flowing toward the source, not the subject. Interviews increased. Followers grew. Invitations appeared. Visibility changed incentives. And incentives change behavior even when intentions were initially benign. This doesn't mean the man set out to deceive. It means the environment rewarded continuation. And continuation requires narrative maintenance. Narrative maintenance is where stories get fragile. Because maintaining coherence under scrutiny requires either evidence or adjustment. And adjustment leaves fingerprints. As timelines were examined more closely, small changes appeared. Not dramatic contradictions, but refinements. Clarifications that conveniently resolved earlier issues without acknowledging them. This raised eyebrows. Why weren't these details mentioned earlier? Why did they emerge only after scrutiny? These questions didn't trend, but they circulated among people trained to notice patterns. And patterns were emerging. Another development further complicated things. A second person, unrelated to the original interviews, independently checked records and reached the same conclusion about the timeline mismatch. This convergence mattered. One discrepancy can be dismissed. Two independent confirmations are harder to ignore. This didn't mean the entire story was false, but it meant it was unstable. And unstable stories don't survive long without reinforcement. Which brings us back to silence. Meghan still hadn't spoken. But now, silence wasn't being read as avoidance. It was being read as confidence. Because when the loudest accusations lose momentum under scrutiny, silence stops looking like fear and starts looking like patience. That shift doesn't happen often. And when it does, it changes everything. Public sentiment didn't flip. It softened. And softening is enough. Because outrage requires sharp edges. Softness dulls them. Still. But Harry didn't give them any. Instead, he let the story move past him. And that choice began reframing perception. Rather than looking defensive, he began to look detached. Not indifferent, but unwilling to participate. That distinction matters. Detachment signals confidence. Defensiveness signals fear. As days passed, the absence of reaction from Harry created a contrast. While creators argued, sources hedged, and narratives fractured, he remained static. This steadiness had an unintended effect. It anchored doubt. If the story were truly explosive, truly irrefutable, wouldn't Harry react? Wouldn't he defend his wife publicly, given his history of speaking out? The fact that he didn't suggested one of two things. Either the claims weren't worth legitimizing, or there was nothing substantive to respond to. Neither interpretation favored the narrative's momentum. This is where audience psychology shifted again. People began asking not what Harry should say, but why the story hadn't forced his hand. Because scandals that stick usually provoke reaction. They disrupt schedules. They generate statements. They compel movement. This one wasn't doing that, which raised an uncomfortable possibility. What if the story was already losing relevance among those closest to it? At the same time, Harry's past words were resurfaced. Interviews where he spoke about misinformation. Statements about protecting his family. Warnings about media-driven harm. These clips, once dismissed by critics as exaggeration, now played differently. They sounded less defensive and more prophetic. That reframing didn't vindicate anyone, but it contextualized the present moment. Harry had seen this pattern before. He had lived it. And now, he appeared unwilling to relive it publicly. That refusal had power. Because participation fuels narratives. Absence starves them. But absence also creates speculation. Some commentators suggested internal conflict. That Harry and Meghan disagreed on strategy. That silence was a compromise. There was no evidence for this. But speculation doesn't require evidence. It requires plausibility. And conflict is always plausible to an audience primed for drama. Still, no signs of division emerged. No leaks. No anonymous briefings. No sudden shifts. That consistency mattered. In high-pressure situations, fractures usually leak. Someone talks. Someone signals. Someone deviates. None of that happened, which suggested alignment. Alignment doesn't mean certainty. It means agreement on approach. And the approach was clear. Do not feed it. This strategy wasn't risk-free. Silence allows damage to accumulate quietly. Rumors leave residue, even when disproven. But sometimes, responding causes more harm than waiting. Harry seemed to be betting on endurance. That bet only works if scrutiny eventually undercuts the story. And by this point, scrutiny was doing exactly that. Behind the scenes, media interest in Harry's response waned. Journalists weren't chasing him for comment. Editors weren't holding space for his reaction. Because the story had stopped advancing. It was looping. And loops are death for viral momentum. Meanwhile, Harry's absence shifted attention back where it didn't want to go. Toward verification. Toward evidence. Toward contradictions. The more he didn't engage, the more the story had to stand on its own. And standing on its own was becoming difficult. But there was another layer here that few acknowledged. Harry's silence wasn't just strategic. It was personal. He has spoken openly about the cost of engaging with rumor. About how responding often escalates harm rather than resolving it. About how defending against every accusation becomes a trap. So his refusal to speak wasn't just calculated. It was informed by experience. That experience gives weight to his absence. It suggests that he didn't see this as a moment that required intervention. And that judgment carries implications. Because if those closest to the story don't treat it as urgent, the audience eventually follows. Slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably. Still, the story wasn't finished. Because while Harry stayed silent publicly, pressure was building elsewhere. Pressure on creators who had amplified the claims. Pressure on platforms hosting content. Pressure on outlets considering follow-ups. And that pressure was about to surface in a way no one expected. Not through a statement, not through a denial, through accountability. And once accountability entered the frame, the conversation would shift again, away from personalities, away from rumors, toward responsibility. And that shift would force some uncomfortable reckonings. Because it wouldn't ask who was right. It would ask who was reckless. And the answers to that question would implicate far more people than anyone anticipated. The moment the word verification entered the conversation, everything tightened. Because verification doesn't care about vibes. It doesn't care about instincts. It doesn't care how convincing a story feels. Verification asks one brutal question. Can this be independently confirmed? And once that question becomes central, narratives either solidify or unravel. Up to this point, the story had survived on implication, on atmosphere, on suggestion. It didn't need proof because it didn't demand it. The outrage economy had already done the heavy lifting. But as momentum slowed and credibility questions accumulated, the spotlight turned towards something far less dramatic. Facts, not opinions, not interpretations, not emotional reactions. Facts. And facts are stubborn. The first thing investigators did was map timelines, not based on memory, but on records. Public appearances, employment histories, travel windows, contracts, interviews that could be dated with certainty. This is tedious work, boring work, and that's exactly why it's effective. Because boring work isn't driven by narrative desire. It's driven by elimination. When timelines were laid out side by side, a pattern emerged. Not confirmation, not exoneration, but improbability. The claims required a series of overlaps. Specific places, specific times, specific access. None of these individually disproved the story, but together they strained it. Strain matters. A story that requires multiple unlikely coincidences without supporting evidence doesn't collapse immediately. It bends, and bending reveals stress points. One stress point involved travel. Another involved employment. Another involved documented commitments that narrowed windows of possibility far more than the story accounted for. These weren't dramatic revelations. They didn't make headlines. But they circulated quietly among people trained to notice such things. Journalists, legal analysts, researchers, the kind of people who don't tweet first. As these analyses spread, requests for corroboration intensified. Not accusations. Requests. Who else can confirm this? Who remembers this differently? Is there any independent witness willing to speak on the record? The answers were thin. Not hostile. Not defensive. Thin. And thin answers don't satisfy verification standards. This is where the distinction between possibility and plausibility becomes critical. Something can be possible without being plausible. Verification demands plausibility supported by evidence. And evidence was still absent. At the same time, another subtle shift occurred. People stopped repeating the claims verbatim. They began paraphrasing them. This might seem insignificant, but it's not. Paraphrasing is a sign of narrative decay. It means the original phrasing no longer feels stable enough to quote. People smooth it out, adjust it, make it safer. Safer language means higher awareness of risk. Creators added disclaimers. Allegedly, according to claims. If true, that linguistic shift tells you something. Confidence was slipping. But the most important verification question wasn't about location or dates. It was about motive. Why would someone wait so long to speak? Why now? Why in this way? Motive doesn't prove truth or falsehood, but it contextualizes behavior. And context matters when evidence is thin. As analysts examined the timing more closely, they noticed alignment with something else. Visibility. The emergence of the story coincided with increased attention toward the source. Invitations, interviews, follower growth, opportunities that hadn't existed before. This doesn't imply bad faith, but it introduces incentive. And incentive is the invisible hand behind many narratives. When attention becomes rewarding, stories tend to expand, not contract. That expansion was visible here. Early interviews were cautious. Later ones were more detailed. Certainty increased over time. That trajectory runs counter to how verified accounts usually behave. Verified accounts narrow as scrutiny increases. Unverified stories often sharpen. This observation didn't go unnoticed. Skeptical voices began asking whether the story had become self-sustaining, whether the attention itself was shaping the narrative. These questions didn't trend, but they mattered, because once a story is perceived as attention-driven, trust erodes rapidly. Then came the most damaging realization of all. Verification doesn't require proving something false. It requires proving something true. And so far, no one had done that. There were no independent witnesses speaking publicly. No contemporaneous records supporting the claims. No corroborating accounts aligning cleanly with the timeline. Only repetition. And repetition is not evidence. This is where the story entered a dangerous limbo. Too loud to ignore completely. Too weak to confirm responsibly. In that limbo, institutions retreat. Editors hesitate. Platforms hedge. Legal teams intervene. Content moderation becomes cautious. Language softens further. Distance increases. The story didn't disappear. But it lost authority. And authority is what turns rumor into record. Without authority, narratives drift. They become references rather than revelations. Footnotes rather than facts. That shift was subtle, but decisive. People stopped saying, "This happened." They started saying, "There were claims." That single grammatical change is everything. Because claims can be discussed without endorsement. Facts cannot. Meanwhile, the public began experiencing something else. Fatigue. Outrage is exhausting. Sustaining anger without resolution drains attention. And without new developments, stories stall. Verification stalled the narrative not by disproving it, but by refusing to elevate it. That refusal was powerful, because in the absence of proof, restraint became the dominant response among those with influence. Still, one question remained. If the claims were so fragile, why had they traveled so far? The answer wasn't about truth. It was about structure. Stories like this thrive because they fit pre-existing frameworks. They confirm suspicions. They satisfy emotional narratives. They don't require effort. Verification requires effort. And most people don't engage with effort unless prompted. That's why verification often arrives late. By the time facts are checked, beliefs are formed. But even formed beliefs can soften when authority withdraws. And authority was withdrawing now. Quietly, methodically. The story wasn't being fought. It was being outgrown. Yet something else was happening beneath the surface. As verification undermined the claims, attention began shifting again. Away from the subject. Away from the source. Toward the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. Because if this story could spread so far with so little verification, what does that say about the environment we're all participating in? That question was about to become central. And when it did, the conversation would move beyond individuals and into something far more uncomfortable. Collective responsibility. Because once you stop asking who is guilty and start asking how narratives spread unchecked, the mirror turns outward. And not everyone likes what they see. Credibility doesn't collapse all at once. It frays, thread by thread, answer by answer, reaction by reaction. By the time Chapter 8 begins, the story is no longer being judged on what was claimed, but on how the claimant behaves when the spotlight refuses to move on. And this is where things become uncomfortable. Because scrutiny doesn't just examine words. It examines patterns. As attention narrowed onto the source, journalists and independent researchers began doing something the internet rarely does well. They went backwards. Not to find dirt. Not to confirm bias. But to establish consistency. What has this person said before? How have they described similar events in the past? Do their accounts align over time? This kind of review doesn't look for lies. It looks for drift. And drift is revealing. Earlier statements, some buried deep in long-form interviews that never went viral, painted a slightly different picture than the later, more widely circulated ones. Not radically different. Not enough to spark outrage on their own, but different enough to raise questions. Descriptions of the environment shifted. The level of familiarity implied changed. The certainty increased. These weren't contradictions that screamed deception. They whispered instability. And instability matters. Because credibility isn't about whether someone ever misspeaks. It's about whether their core narrative remains intact under pressure. Here, it didn't. One example stood out. In earlier remarks, the source emphasized distance, observation, peripheral awareness. The sense of being around something rather than part of it. Later, that distance narrowed. Suddenly, Interactions felt closer. Knowledge felt more intimate. Insight felt more specific. That evolution could be explained in many ways. Memory retrieval, prompted recollection, clarifying misunderstood points. All plausible, but the pattern was consistent. The more attention the story received, the more vivid it became. That's not how verified accounts usually behave. Verified accounts tend to become cautious under scrutiny. They hedge. They narrow. They say less, not more. This story did the opposite. It expanded. Another pattern emerged around response behavior. When supporters praised the source, engagement followed. When critics asked for clarification, defensiveness appeared. When journalists requested corroboration, delays occurred. This asymmetry matters. People confident in their account usually welcome skeptical questions because those questions offer a chance to solidify truth. People invested in narrative survival often prefer affirmation. That doesn't mean deception. It means pressure, and pressure reveals priorities. At the same time, something else was happening. Third parties who had been loosely referenced began distancing themselves. Not publicly, but quietly. Declining interviews. Avoiding mention. Asking not to be quoted. This wasn't coordinated. It was organic. And organic withdrawal is telling. Because people who believe a story is solid usually don't fear association with it. People who sense fragility do. Another detail raised eyebrows. When asked about verification, the source often redirected to intention, to how their words were meant, to how they felt misunderstood. Intent matters emotionally. But verification doesn't evaluate intent. It evaluates alignment with reality. This disconnect became more pronounced as scrutiny intensified. Instead of narrowing claims to what could be supported, the narrative leaned on framing, on implication, on what listeners should infer rather than what could be shown. Inference is powerful, but it's not evidence. And this is where the story began losing institutional support. Not through condemnation, through disengagement. Journalists stopped calling. Editors stopped asking follow-ups. Platforms stopped promoting. The story didn't end. It stalled. And stalling is devastating in the attention economy. Because attention doesn't wait for resolution. It moves on. Yet something curious happened during this stall. The source didn't retreat. They leaned in. More interviews. More commentary. More attempts to reassert the narrative. This move surprised some observers. If the story were solid, waiting would allow verification to catch up. But leaning in suggested urgency. Urgency often signals fear of loss. Loss of relevance. Loss of control. Loss of narrative ownership. This is where credibility becomes a performance. Not in a theatrical sense, but in a strategic one. The story needed to stay alive long enough to matter. And that necessity created tension. Because the more it stayed alive, the more scrutiny it invited. This feedback loop is brutal. Attention brings scrutiny. Scrutiny demands evidence. Evidence fails to appear. Attention becomes risky. Most viral stories die here. But this one lingered just long enough to transform. The focus shifted again. Away from the claims. Away from Meghan. Away from even the source. Toward the ecosystem that allowed such a fragile narrative to dominate discourse for as long as it did. This pivot didn't absolve anyone. It reframed responsibility. Because if credibility could erode so visibly, why did so many amplify it so confidently? Why did creators jump from uncertainty to certainty without pause? Why did audiences reward escalation over caution? Why did platforms elevate emotion over verification? These questions were uncomfortable because they implicated everyone. And once people feel implicated, defensiveness spreads. Creators began issuing explanations. Not apologies. Explanations. Why they covered the story. Why they framed it the way they did. Why they trusted the source. Those explanations often centered on one phrase. People deserve to know. But knowing what? Claims without corroboration? Speculation without structure? Emotion without accountability? The phrase sounded noble, but it avoided the harder question. Who deserves protection from harm caused by unverified amplification? That question doesn't trend, but it lingers. As this meta-conversation gained traction, the original narrative lost ground. It no longer served as the centerpiece. It became a case study, a warning, and warnings don't need to be proven in the same way accusations do. They only need to be plausible. This inversion was ironic. The story that once demanded belief now demanded reflection. And reflection is the opposite of outrage. Meanwhile, the source found themselves in an awkward position. No longer the center of attention, no longer the authority, but not fully dismissed either. Suspended. That suspension is where credibility goes to fade. Not dramatically, quietly. Still, one unresolved thread remained. Throughout the scrutiny, one specific inconsistency kept resurfacing. Not loudly, not conclusively, but persistently. It involved a record that had not yet been fully explained. A record that, if clarified, could stabilize the story or end it. Requests for clarification around this detail had gone unanswered. Not denied, not refuted, unanswered. And unanswered questions don't disappear. They accumulate. The longer they remain unresolved, the heavier they become. Because silence around a specific fact is different from silence around a narrative. It suggests avoidance rather than strategy. And if that record were ever addressed publicly, it would force a reckoning. Either the story would find footing, or it would collapse under its own weight. That moment hadn't arrived yet, but it was approaching, and when it did, it wouldn't come from a six.